Everyone, and welcome to the third. Introduce you to Robert Johnson. He's a very experienced intercultural trainer working both in the business sector but also in the university sector, lecturing on cross-cultural management. Rob's lived in Japan and also in France and Germany, so I think he can bring a lot of real experiences to the cross-cultural training room in terms of things that he's lived and felt when he's been working overseas himself. And he's also a trained mediator, so he'll have a lot of insights in terms of the topic we have today for you. So let me hand you over to Rob. We'll be together till about 3 o'clock our time, so about an hour. But as I say, we'll allow a little bit of time at the end for questions. So I hope you enjoy the session, and I'll hand over to Rob. Thank you, Rob. Over to you.
Hi there. It's really great to be here, and yeah, welcome your understanding of conflict and its role in international business relations. To develop your knowledge of different culturally based orientations toward conflict, and to consider your own individual approaches to conflict and how you might develop your conflict management skills for international teamwork. If you have any problems with these objectives, then, well, let's step outside and have a fight about it. Okay, so we're here about conflict. We're here about, people. People staff a lot of irrational things going on, and it's really interesting when you add in the element of culture. Um, Personally, I've had experience of conflict. Well, I don't know how much conflict I've had, but I've had to deal with different intercultural situations, different interpersonal situations. So, as Kathy said in the introduction, I hope to bring some of that insight into our talk today. And I also want to make sure that you get to have a say through the chat function. You're welcome to put forward any questions at any time. Remember that everyone can see your name and your question, so don't be too insulting. Oh, okay. Yeah, really, make sure that you have a chance to get involved. We're going to start off with a bit of interaction here. So let's give this drawing thing a go. Where do you stand in your personal relationships? How often do you engage in open argument or conflict, whatever that means, however you interpret that, of one kind or another? And use your arrow or use the draw function. I think I've got something here. I can put myself down here, if you can see that. Oh, we've got one tick there. So tick A, frequently. It's good to get things off your chest and clear the air. There's somebody. B, sometimes, but it depends on a lot of factors. C, occasionally, when I want to make my feelings clear to the other party. Or D, hardly ever. I think conflict should be avoided if at all possible. So I'll give you a moment to kind of have a look at that and put your ticks in. Good, we're getting a few coming in now. This is anonymous, by the way, so you can put what you want there. I guess it's really down to the question of, do you enjoy conflict? It's a funny question, but I'm thinking of personal acquaintances of mine, couples who spend a lot of time arguing together, and it's just part of who they are. They enjoy arguing. They enjoy getting at each other, niggling. For them, a good disagreement is normal. Personally, I'm down here in D. I really don't like conflict. I like to avoid it, and I see that as pretty strange to be at each other's throats all the time. But some people just seem to thrive off of it, and couples seem to thrive off of it as well. They really do, often, from my point of view, really, get involved in something really personal. But afterwards, it's immediately gone. It disappears into the air and it's all resolved quickly. Whereas there are other people, maybe like me, who tend to button it up and not release emotion so much. If I've got a problem with someone, oh, really? Okay, sure, fine. I'll just carry on as if nothing has happened. But, I'll find a way later to try to make my feelings known. But often I won't do it so much. It seems in our group today online, we've got some of you right at the top who are quite into conflict or at least enjoy arguing with others. And at the bottom, yeah, like me, quite a few who don't really see it as very positive. Um, but I think it's really interesting to think about this in terms of your relationships with other people and also intercultural relationships with other people. What are the dynamics here? We may judge other people more or less. We may know that other people are individually more kind of conflictive in their argument style or less. And what's interesting is we can often blame that on culture, or we can often excuse it with culture. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. It's very interesting for intercultural relationships when you look at that. Now, in terms of interpersonal relationships and intercultural romantic relationships, it's very interesting. There's a program here in the UK at the moment which shows mediation taking place between often married couples who are, let's say, experiencing a few difficulties and who may be locked in a conflict, who may be disagreeing, who may be separated, who may be wanting to divorce, all of these things, and it's uncomfortable viewing at times. But there are people called mediators who go in and try to deal with this kind of conflict. And what's remarkable in terms of the conflict that exists between two people who may know each other very well, who may have chosen to get married and so on, is that often it's a conflict that comes from an emotional side. It's not logical whatsoever. Conflict itself, as we can define it, is a situation where two parties with opposing interests or contrasting objectives come into contact in an interpersonal, relationship, in an intercultural relationship. These contrasting objectives may be very minor, or may be very major. The minor ones, where you want to go on holiday, or whether you want to have a holiday, or how much you want to spend on this or that. But the major ones may be, big decisions. Do you want to get married? Do you want to have children? These can cause conflict. Do you want to move to a different house? Do you want to spend time with different people? Do you want to change job? All of these big things can be different contrasting objectives and opposing interests. And when those hit each other, it can cause conflict. Interestingly enough, conflict is not always acknowledged by both sides. So one person may feel as though everything is going very well, no problems. The other side really is incensed, is absolutely angry that the other side is not treating them with respect or not listening to them. And so it's interesting that conflict may only exist on one side from one perspective, but it's conflict and there's a lot of awareness raising that needs to go on. Now, for me, what's really interesting and what brought me into the subject really of conflict and conflict resolution, conflict management, is the fact that it seems to underlie a lot of human relations. And that in the West, here in the UK, in the US, in Western Europe in general, we very strongly like to look, especially at business, in terms of logic, about things that make sense. But conflict often doesn't make sense. Humans often don't make sense. We bypass logic. It's the emotional side. And there's a very interesting sort of bit of research about the parts of the brain involved when in conflict situations. Basically, our emotions take over, and the logic side of the brain shuts down. And this is what happens with people wherever they are. How they express things, of course, may be different in some cultures. And for some individuals, they would express them very directly, in others less so. But it's called the amygdala, the part of the brain which is kind of the emotional side. And in this particular aspect of when the emotions take control is called the amygdala hijack. So our brain refers to its kind of, it reverts to its kind of an animal sense. in effect, it's kind of the fear or the idea of protecting yourself, and it overrides any kind of logic, and then says, well, this is what I'm going to do. And in the interpersonal stage, we see mediators trying to break down this emotional side because people will often stick to a very stubborn approach into conflict, even when rationally, if you take a step back, it isn't actually the best for them, or it doesn't make sense, or it's not actually constructive to do that because it's emotional. So I think this is really important to understand. It's emotional, and it's often we're not actually in control. Even the most logical of people, has emotions running underneath, and their decisions are not as rational as they believe. And there's a lot of interesting work that's been done on this in terms of consumer behavior, behavioral economics, our judgments and our ways of making decisions. Um, this brings in some really interesting things about our impression that things are very rational, but in fact, they're often not. Now, conflict itself is considered pretty undesirable, but we have to say it's inevitable. Conflict throughout history is inevitable. There are peaceful times, but even in peaceful times, people are kind of annoying each other, rubbing up against each other. There's friction between people. And so, rather than seeing conflict as something negative, I think it is quite constructive to see conflict as something, well, not so positive, but it could have some positive outcomes. So I'm saying without conflict, there's no progress. On an interesting sense, if you look at the climate change um, negotiations, there was a conference a few years ago in Copenhagen, and the powers that be came together and tried to reach an agreement and failed. There was failure. Um, Conflict was not resolved in a favorable way. There was some kind of fudge where a document was signed, but not everyone was happy. There were issues with power and with proportionality and how much was going on, but it wasn't really an effective response. And so, in effect, that raised the stakes for the Paris talks at the end of last year. And thankfully, the powers that be came together and reached a much better agreement. So I think there was conflict before, and out of that conflict came progress in some ways. So you could say, in many different levels, we should see conflict as a good thing, or at least something that can lead to progress. All right. Um, so I'm going to move it on to sort of the business side now, and I'm going to ask a question. Why do people fight in the workplace? And if you want, feel free to write something down in the chat box. In your experience, in your environment, why do people get involved in conflict? What exactly are the causes of this? What are people fighting over? What, in your view, are the causes of conflict in the workplace? So, yeah, so we've immediately got one there, which is difference of opinion, and people saying that people feel passionate about what they're trying to achieve. They have different perspectives. This is what I tried to express in the definition of conflict, where you've got different perspectives, different interests, um, and very perceptive there that it's often about miscommunication, different targets and agendas, different, I think, positions and visions. Yeah, so we've got a range of different issues in the workplace that, of course, are interesting. Unlike intercultural relationships, it's interesting. In the workplace, you often don't get to choose who you work with. So it's people in an enclosed space forced to work together, and there may be personal differences. Um, we've got some more here. We've got power struggle. We've got they don't like each other. Yeah, the personal differences. They can't understand the differences between departments and the process of each area, and sometimes they fight for power. These are all really good. I mean, I've expressed exactly what you've expressed there in your personal experience. I've said organizational priorities, structures, and role definitions. Industrial disputes. I did some interesting training quite a few years ago for ACAS, which is an arbitration organization, which goes in when there are industrial disputes between, commercial organizations and the unions and so on, and it's trying to, well, solve the disputes between them. But within a company as well, you can have real differences. You're fighting for resources and remuneration. You may feel as though you've been overlooked for promotion, and that a colleague has been, favoritism or something like that, or you may feel that the organization is not treating you fairly compared to other people, so that can lead to conflict. Strategies, goals, priorities in the organization, these are all really, really important aspects. And of course, in terms of this personal stuff, power and influence, office politics, the real struggles that go on, even in very settled and stable organizations, this can cause tremendous problems, especially at the top of organizations if there are power struggles. As some of you pointed out, personality differences can cause conflict. And I think communication issues are obviously at the heart of what's going on within a conflict situation. That's why it's so interesting. And I'm going to add something that I don't think that you've put there because it's related and it's kind of in the background in international business, and that's cultural differences. I think culture can cause conflict just because there are different resources being fought over, or different levels of engagement in a project, or one side feeling that another side isn't pulling their weight. And that can be cultural. Of course, it can relate to history between different cultures. So we've got an issue in the current Olympic Games in Rio, where athletes from particular cultures are refusing to shake hands with athletes from other cultures. Now, that may not be personal, but it's in the background of the relations between the two countries. And I think in martial arts, I think one of the athletes was sent home for not shaking hands because it's part of the protocol. But of course, think of the emotion that is in that, and the emotion of the person who feels excluded for doing something that they feel is a conviction. It can go very deep and cause just problem upon problem in terms of conflict. So there are those overt cultural differences that can cause problems, but also I think subtle cultural differences can exacerbate what's going on in workplaces in terms of the guessing game. Is the other person not talking to me because they don't like me? Are they not talking to me because they don't talk to people? They're quite reserved as an individual? Or is there something cultural? Is it a cultural difference in terms of people not customarily writing lots of emails, writing lots of reports unless they're asked to do so? So I think culture is an interesting factor in this. And whatever we're doing here, it can have an impact in work. In terms of retention of employees, it's very, very common in organizations that are suffering conflict of any kind that we can see in this list, that retention is difficult. So we have high turnover rates that can be coming out of that. It's difficult to keep teams together. And therefore, as managers in international environments, it's really important to take this into account. And I think this is why, in the intercultural field, as an intercultural trainer, I spend quite a bit of my time focusing on communication, focusing on how you manage relationships between people, focusing on how you deal with stereotypes between people and the history between nations that can affect interpersonal relationships. And then the actual skill, the skill of dealing with conflict, both personally, actually having the sang-froid or the level-headedness to deal with it without getting too emotional, for yourself and also for other people who are in conflict with each other. So we've got some really interesting aspects that come out of that. Now, what I thought I would do now is to set up another situation. It's a simple situation for you to look at. And we're going to look at language now. So what I'd like you to do is to look at this scenario. A colleague fails to provide the correct documents on time, which causes you some embarrassment and makes you look unprofessional in front of an important client. So this might happen. It has happened to me. How would you deal with this situation? And what exactly would you say to your colleague the next time you see them? So here, what I'd like you to do in the chat box is to reflect for a moment and actually think about the exact words that you would use when you see this person face to face in order to bring up, hello, but beyond that, how would you bring this up? What kind of language would you use? So I'd like to collect a few examples there. Have a think, and then write down what words would you use in this situation? Good. So we'll get a few ideas coming through there in a moment, and I look forward to getting your ideas. So um, the reason why we're looking at this is because I think it's really interesting to consider the use of language and the impact that can have, and what is customary in particular environments, in particular places. I'm going to be looking for an impact of culture, but of course, everyone is different. But it's interesting to think that impact of culture. Um, and of course, when we say culture in the intercultural field, I think you can think about national culture, but we can also think about many different levels of culture that may have an impact in a particular situation. Depends on where this person comes from, but it may be different national culture, it may be different regional culture. So even within somewhere like the United Kingdom, you can have differences in regional culture, people having different ways of seeing each other, different ways of expressing themselves. In the UK, for example, I don't know, Yorkshire in the mid to north of England is known as being quite a direct speaking culture, and they may approach conflict in a more direct approach than the soft Southerners like myself. So I'm going to have a look at some of your examples now, and so have a look at these answers, and what I want you to think about is what is the degree of what is the degree of directness in these answers? While I give you a bit more time to type, and we'll have a look at those answers in a moment, I'm also going to say something, of course, about the thing that is in your head, which says, well, in this situation, hey, it depends. It depends on so many things. And here I've put some of the things it can depend on, of course, in a conflict situation. Who is involved in a conflict situation? Is it two people talking together, or are you in front of 2,000 or 2 million? So what kind of conflict are we talking about? Are you close associates? How long have you known each other? What's the past history? Has there been conflict in the past? These things can also be very significant. Um, Interestingly, we could be more direct with people who we don't know, complete strangers in the street, for example, than if we're with someone we know a lot. Or it might work the other way, where we know people and therefore we go over a certain threshold and we can be direct with them. We can speak much more directly. The second one here, where is the conflict taking place? Of course, is it in public or is it in private? The way that you express yourself and these great examples that you're giving in the chat box here will depend on whether it's in front of other people. And here I want to stress, of course, the cultural factor of face. Many cultures are very sensitive towards face, and that can have a significant impact in how a particular phrase will come across or how a particular message will be interpreted and how that affects the other person. We've got issues like who has the right to take part or how representative they are. So an example might be, for example, we had some TV debates, and when you're having political debates, who represents particular parties. We've just been through a quite disastrous Brexit issue here in the United Kingdom, and we had TV debates on that. And who represents the Brexit party? The Leave campaign and the Remain campaign. Is it this person or that person? That could be a matter of conflict as well. Um, Moving down to the bottom line, who has power over whom, and what is the basis for that power? Clearly, this is a big factor in conflict, and one could say that that's a fascinating area of research as well, just to see the difference. In the scenario I just presented to you, which I'll show again, it would make a big difference to whether that colleague was the same level as you, more junior than you, or more senior than you. So clearly, that would be a big factor there. Who will be affected by the outcome? This would be very important. And then finally, what are the rules of engagement? I mean, this is where the culture comes in as well. What are the general rules for interacting? What are the rules for communication? How direct are you generally when you're dealing with people, and how expressive are you in terms of your emotions. So I'm going to go back and look at some of these examples now, and they all look really interesting. So Alison here, I'm just wondering what happened to the documents we talked about for that client meeting. How would you rate that? It's very interesting to look at that. Um, and then again, I'd like to know what happened that you weren't able to provide the correct documents. Um, and then if we look at Marcia Matos, then we've got what happened and how can I help you? So that's very interesting. It's sort of a direct question, but then how can I help you? And then Simone here, a little bit more expressive, let's say. Oh my God, what am I going to do? What shall I do when I meet the client? Expressing that emotion much more directly. Um, and Yep, another sort of more indirect way here with Faiza. If you have a moment, I wanted to speak with you about the document that I requested for the client. It was an important deadline, so I wanted to know what happened. It put me in a tricky position. So you're explaining the situation, trying to explain to them the situation you were in, and hopefully they'll pick it up. So in this simple situation, it's a matter of trying to get that message across, and you hope that they are kind of picking up your message. But you can see that as I move on to the next slide, there can be different approaches. Personal approaches, it can depend a lot on the situation. It can depend a lot on, generally the relationship that you have with this person, the status difference, all of these things, the choices you make in the language you use, and how directly you take it up. Now, you might be generally a direct person, or you might choose to follow this particular direct path. Um, and on this side, we say that conflict should be dealt with directly. If someone has done something wrong or someone has done something you don't like, then in many cultures and in many situations, people would say you should express it directly. Be direct, express your emotions, make your feelings clear and open. Use a low context communication style. So this means that you don't hide anything. You're very precise and explicit in what you're saying. We find this a lot in individualistic cultures, who tend to have a more direct approach and a more task orientation, especially in business. If you're business-like, then you say, well, we have an issue, let's get it out on the table and we should deal with it. This sounds fine, of course. This is really, really important, but there is another view. And the danger of this approach in whatever situation is that you go too far, that it comes across as too direct. And if you're from the other side, let's say from a culture that is a bit more indirect, or as a person who prefers to be a bit more indirect, like me, I'm very quite indirect, you feel that conflict should be avoided if possible. You prefer an indirect approach in general. Of course, it depends on the situation, it depends on the relationship, but you don't tend to express your emotions so much. You would have a high context communication style. You would expect people to kind of work out what you mean from less evidence, let's say, from the words that you're saying. And we find this a lot in more collectivistic cultures, and where cultures have a bit more of a relationship orientation. These are broad generalizations, but you can say in terms of culture that some cultures tend to be more on one side and some cultures tend to be more on the other side. I mean, it's dangerous to stereotype too much, but you can see differences, and certainly you can see differences in the way that people tend to approach conflict. So on the direct side, I certainly feel that I guess Americans tend to be more direct than Brits. I think as a general statement, you could say that. We tend to be, slightly less direct here in the UK, whereas Americans tend to deal with things quite directly. Maybe I'm thinking of, Hollywood films or New York culture, possibly, Robert De Niro. Are you looking at me? All of this stuff. Maybe that's a stereotype, but in situations and in business situations that I've had, it's really clear that there is less of a concern with softening the blow. And here's why I was kind of talking about the iron glove and the silk, the iron fist and the silk glove in my introduction that you should have seen about conflict. Some cultures have no problem with being much more direct. Within Europe, you could say that Germany, Russia, tend to be more direct. In other parts of the world, South Africa, um, tend to be very, very direct in their communication style in general. Um, and therefore, their approach to conflict may be seen as quite brutal at times in extreme situations, or just a little bit, kind of direct. Now, if you know a person who is direct in their communication style, then you'll probably accept that they will go into a conflict situation that is more direct, and they may come across as being a bit rude. But it's interesting how we can often underestimate that aspect of culture. We take it using our own frame of reference, and we can take offense really without being aware of it, even though we're aware of cultural differences. So this is one scale, and of course you can think about where you would see yourself on there. It's a very established scale in intercultural communication, but I wanted in this session to introduce a little bit more subtlety because, of course, it's not just as simple as that. And we have a model here, a sort of classic model of conflict management orientations. It's an academic model, so I didn't want to bore you with this. So I've sort of adapted it slightly. But basically, on one side, you've got the kind of aspect of cooperation, how important that is for you. Your goal is maintaining the relationship, and that goes from 0 at the bottom right to the top, which would be very high. And then at the bottom, we've got assertiveness, and this is kind of how assertive you are in dealing with conflict. And your goal here is for yourself and pushing your own agenda forward and trying, in effect, to beat the opposition. And very briefly, you can see how I will have adapted this. If you're very, very assertive in conflict styles, in this kind of strategy or an orientation, then let's call you the shark. So you believe in competition, in forcing a resolution in your favor. Okay, so the individual goals are very high. The relationship goals, you don't actually worry about them too much. And when a shark meets a shark, neither of them are worried about the relationship. They are coming head to head. If you think about, I don't know, America and Russia during the Cold War, these are probably two sharks banging heads for decades, almost, causing nuclear war, basically, because they wouldn't back down, and it was very much about competition and forcing the resolution in their favor. Very different from that, we have the turtle, and here very low on the assertiveness scale and also very low on the cooperation scale, it's avoidance. It's, shrinking your head back inside your shell and not actually acknowledging that there is a conflict taking place, really. Avoidance and withdrawal. So this is much more passive, and it might be easy to think that it's not so effective because you're not actually dealing with the issue, but I'll come back to that. Then we have the teddy bear. Okay, so this is an approach where you've got accommodation, smoothing things over. In fact, you're actually giving way to the other side. Say, okay, you're right, you have it your way, and then you kind of live to fight another day. Teddy bears tend to be pretty popular in groups. In general, they're the pacifiers. They're those people who kind of step in and sort things out, but they don't necessarily get their own way. There are two more positions on this scale. One is in the middle, the fox, compromise, negotiation, sort of you give way. It's kind of a 50-50 thing, a pragmatic approach in some ways. And then finally we have the owl. So this is about collaboration and problem solving, which sounds fantastic. But of course there are problems with that because often it's very difficult to get the other side to sit down and collaborate, and different ways of approaching conflict. And it's very interesting to consider the dynamics of these different types. So what I'd like you to do now is to have a look at this and of course think where you might be. But it's not that you are one of these all the time, but maybe what is your dominant style? Okay, so that would be interesting to consider for yourself in general interactions with people. If you have a difficulty, are you quite forceful? Or do you try to pacify? Do you step back? Do you avoid the situation and come back to it later? Do you try to work things through in a much more cognitive and sort of intellectual way as well? You're trying to, find um, a long-term solution. So have a think where you stand yourselves. And then I think it might be interesting here again to use um, the chat function to see if you can generalize about the cultures that you know. And when I say culture, can you identify where you would find any of the national cultures that you know here, or a comparison between two cultures, and why there might be a problem between two cultures in general because of their cultural orientations. So I think it might be interesting. Good. Some of you are adding arrows to where you think you may be, and please carry on with that. Put a little tick where you think you would find your dominant style, the way you would mostly be. So please carry on with that. But also, if you could add any ideas about cultures that you know which might fall into any of these categories. We're generalizing, of course, but when I say cultures, it could be the culture of an organization, it could be the culture of a region, it could be the culture of a particular department that you in your organization, or it could be a particular person. I'm imagining that Donald Trump would be, yeah, pretty far down in the bottom right-hand corner of this scale. So any thoughts on that in the chat function? Do you know? We're getting a nice picture of I think it's a fox. I think it's a fox. It's either that or it's a mouse that's just got onto the screen. Um, Good. So I'm going to see if you come up with some ideas about where these lie. Clearly, if we think about intercultural interaction or just interpersonal interaction and how you manage conflict, how you manage your difficult situations, it can be very useful to have an awareness of, first of all, self-awareness, um, and what you tend to be and how emotional you are, and how direct you tend to be. And also of some tendencies. If you know that your counterpart as an individual or their cultural background makes them quite shark-like, or quite turtle-like, then you've got to decide how to deal with that. And hopefully, as a good interculturalist and as someone who is open-minded, you'll see that there are benefits and costs to each of these. It's not always good to be a shark. For example, if you're always a shark, then basically you have no friends. If you're a turtle, then fine, you stay out of trouble, but your I guess your problem is that you don't really deal with things. But of course, there may be an issue with that. The teddy bear and the turtle are kind of living to fight another day. And also, I think it's interesting. There was a question there about Japan. In my experience in Japan, the Japanese do tend to be turtles. They tend to try to carry on as if nothing has happened. But it's kind of in a belief that emotions are not so good in the moment. So take a step back, let the other side cool off, and then you can go back to it at a later time and deal with it in an indirect way. This is interesting, and in general, I'd say Japan is more of a turtle. Um, it can depend on your experience. We've got a nice example in the chat box for the Taiwanese, the teddy bears, versus the mainland Chinese as the sharks. Certainly when you've got a large sort of continent versus a smaller island, the larger continent will try to make its power felt, and that may be in the sense of being a shark. And the teddy bears will, not want to poke the shark and anger it too much. But it's a good example of how in Asia, for example, you might find different approaches in different areas and different regions. But the belief of being a teddy bear is that, of course, that you can take a step back and try to get what you want in a more subtle way. Sort of appease and then live to fight another day. So I hope this sort of model, the way I've explained it, is shows you a bit more subtlety in how we might see our approaches. I'm going to finish off really with a few points about, well, just ideas for you to think about. Most of us use a range of these approaches just intuitively. We're not totally aware of it, and as I said, it really depends on your emotions at the time and how engaged you are with it. and how deeply seated the emotions are as well. Um, it's interesting. Understanding the dynamics of the situation will certainly help us to unpack what is going on and formulate a constructive response. And here, knowledge of culture can be very useful. Experience with a culture can be useful when you know, generally what is the response. Um, Prerequisites for working effectively in international environments are empathy, flexibility, and emotional resilience. You know, really being able to take a step back and keep things calm, being able to calm other people down, being flexible in your judgments, and then empathy, which is really important, actually understanding where the other person is coming from. And I want you to think about how you might develop your awareness and skills of these different approaches to improve your effectiveness. Personally, you know, I've been in situations where I've had conflict. I'm thinking of my time in Japan. I lived in Japan for 5 years, and I remember a particular time when I've had a conflict with my Japanese boss, and I've dealt with it actually in quite a direct way. There are various reasons why I dealt with it. It was about resources. It was about me providing a service, and then the rules being changed, and me feeling that I wouldn't be able to provide such a good service to my customers in Japan because of the kind of belt tightening and the shrinking of resources. And I wanted to get that across to my Japanese boss. It was a woman, um, and I sat down with her and I spoke directly with her as directly as I could and said, I think there's a mistake. We shouldn't be reducing our offer to the customers. This is really bad. And well, I got actually a very direct response, which is surprising from the Japanese, isn't it? But actually, in this sense, I was challenging authority. I was challenging the hierarchy, so I was doing the wrong thing as the foreigner, especially. That was quite a bad thing to do. And the boss said, "Rob, you're really difficult to deal with because you always say no." So I said, "No, I don't." And you know, I was adamant I was right, and I was expressing that very directly. In a Japanese way of doing things, that was really wrong. I should not have done that. I should have bided my time. I should have expressed, really, I should have agreed with that. I should have had a meeting with her and said, I see if that's the change, then okay, I will see what I can do. I will try to implement these changes. It's not that I shouldn't have done anything. I should have taken a step back, um, maybe approached using an indirect form of communication, email, for example, and put together a significant case, but not challenged her in front of the whole office. Maybe I should have spoken with my colleagues and got consensus and then gone together in a kind of communal way to express the reservations I had. Um, so it's not that I shouldn't do anything and just accept what was going on, it's that I should have used an indirect way of getting my message across. And that would have been more effective. And that's what I learned from my time in Japan, that it's not necessarily what you're saying, it's how you're saying it, it's the channel that you're using, and it's who you're saying it with. Okay, so that's a little anecdote from my personal experience that I think I learnt from and tended to have a bit more success after that initial bit of friction. Um, so finally, I'll just say a few things. It can only ever be very simple in terms of developing successful strategies for conflict resolution or conflict management. Um, but clearly, you need to be aware of the cultural context, the interpersonal context, the dynamics of the conflict. So awareness is really, really important. You need to avoid the snowball effect. And I think, you know, when it is emotional, you can misunderstand what the other person has said and take it, you know, as an insult. Actually, particularly bad for this is texting. It's very direct and it's very easy to misunderstand what someone is saying in a very short number of letters. And it can be amazing how this can snowball. You know, it can become something really quite a strong conflict when in fact it's just a straight misunderstanding that may be language or it may be culture that's causing it. I think you need to separate the people from the problem. Certainly in business, you need to focus on, you know, what you're doing, focus on interests and not positions. You know, what do you really need to get out of it? You need to keep your emotions in check, learn to take a time out, get people to take a time out if they're in a conflict. Um, and this is something we can learn from different orientations. It's not always best to steamroller in and try to resolve. You might want to just cool it for a while. And then finally shift the focus from what I want to what makes business sense. And also sense for everyone. So from I to we, look for common goals. So clearly, these are very simplistic in some ways, but it's obvious. But it's surprising how many people get involved in a conflict when you can just take a step back and uh, reduce the tension. And that brings me to the end of this short talk. I hope that it has provided some kind of enlightenment for you. I'm sure you all are very capable communicators and very internationally experienced. Um, I'm going to open it up to questions now, and I think we'll bring Kathy Wellings back in to field those questions. And feel free, if you have any extra questions, to write those. I'll have a look back through the chat and see if there were any things that I
Thanks
haven't
so
covered.
much, Rob. I think that was a really
And
insightful
yeah, over to you,
session.
Kathy. I'm just going to have a
Surprising how
read
much we
through.
can cover sometimes in an hour. And it certainly made me kind of re-reflect on my own relationship with conflict. So yeah, please everyone, if you do have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. Rob, I wanted to ask you one question, if I may, which is around, I mean, I know you say that we move naturally from one style to the other, so we might be more of a teddy bear, if you like, in one context and more of an owl in another. But would you advise us to deliberately try and kind of put
Mhm.
on a different style from our own, or would you see some kind of negatives in proactively trying to perhaps be something we're not, if that makes sense?
Yes, clearly,
Mm.
in any difficult situation, you've got to be yourself. And maybe the other people you're dealing with wouldn't expect you to um, suddenly start adopting a very different approach. But I think
Hmm.
sensitivity towards that can be useful. I relate it very much to emotional intelligence, actually, in the sense that we've been seeing emotional intelligence as being very important in terms of managing people in organizations and managing successfully across borders as well. It's part of intercultural competence, which interestingly enough will be part of the next webinar, I notice. But I think in terms of that,
Hmm.
you can actually be strategic in the way that you do things. If you're dealing with someone who you know is very direct, it does help to be direct in return, and you shouldn't worry that your directness is going to be interpreted as insulting or any way that it may be the case in your own culture. I think you can heighten the directness, so you can sort of, actually sort of turn up the directness in order to get the message across. Because if you don't, the message may not get across. And equally, if you're dealing with someone who's very indirect, then you need to turn down the sort of the switch slightly and watch out and be aware of the impact that directness can have on your particular conflict situation. And it may be in your best interests to deal with things less as a shark and more, in a quieter way, or it may be better to look for a quick compromise, or you may have the opportunity, to look for a
Hmm.
better solution, which would be, longer term and the idea of being an owl. As I said, this is from an intercultural point of view, it really looks like the best option to be an owl. But often we don't have the choice, and
Sure.
you can't really
Great,
manage
thank
that.
you. So I guess it's a question
So
of
we
kind
have
of
to be pragmatic.
leaning towards the other style, perhaps rather than mimicking something that we're not. Mm,
Yeah,
yes.
leaning is a good word, I think. Yeah,
So,
yeah. I
which,
think
if
we've got a
any, do you
question at the moment.
think is the influence of historical events like wars or other interventions in the confidence of executives within I guess, within a specific culture? It's an interesting question, quite a complex one.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, thank you, Luciana. There, um, I think these big
Mm.
events and inventions. I mean, that's a really interesting one. The invention of the internet, I don't know, or the invention of particular technology in terms of communication can have an impact. But what you're talking about here is self-confidence of executives from, I guess, from particular areas who are going to work in multicultural environments. This is interesting. I think it's quite difficult to really identify, history in terms of um, whether a country has been victorious in a war or whatever. But it's maybe it's the fact that you do have stereotypes and historical elements in the background when you talk with people. And of course, it can help you with self-confidence, but of course, that can also get in the way. I think it's interesting. Self-confidence is important for leading and managing effectively in multicultural and intercultural environments. But it can lead to complacency and it can lead to arrogance. And so I think the more self-awareness we have, the better.
Mm.
So I think it's a difficult question to answer, but I'd say there's the danger in self-confidence of
And
it
it sounds as though
coming
you're also
across as
saying there's
arrogance.
something about our
So
perceptions as the receiver of that self-confidence might be partly based on stereotypes from our knowledge of history as well. Mm.
indeed, indeed, and these days, certainly with emotional intelligence and cultural competence as well, the idea is that you have to, kind of treat things, kind of put aside the background in some ways as much as possible. In the mediation sort of training that I've done, there's a process called bracketing, which is as a mediator, you have to really step aside from the conflict, step aside from the getting involved in the interests of the parties that you're trying to mediate. And it's called bracketing because you put it in brackets and you put it to one side. You really have to put all of that aside. You put your personal feelings aside and you put your impressions of what they're doing, and you try, if possible, to put any opinions you have about who's right and who's wrong to one side and just let them express things and let them work things out for themselves in many ways, and take it down to what is the common factor, how are we going to proceed in this. So focus on the outcomes rather than
Sure.
the past, the future rather
Great,
than the
thank
past.
you. There's another big question that's come through, if we can try and answer it, which is around from Brendan, whether you consider ethical values to be absolute or cultural specific.
Thanks, Brendan. So we've got 2 minutes for this one. It's a really tough question because I think ethics and culture are very much interrelated in some ways. I think if you look at people who write about ethics, they will say that ethics are universal, that there is right and wrong, and that is universal, and you can't actually find outside of that. But as an interculturalist, I feel it's about how we interpret other people's behavior and how we approach our priorities, about fundamental values as well. And so it it does feel as though culture has a big impact on what is regarded as the right thing to do, or what is interpreted as correct behavior. So I think in that sense, culture does have an impact in what is seen as to be you know ethical or responsible
Hmm.
behavior. And it's a very difficult
Yeah.
question in intercultural relations. And if you think in international joint ventures, it's quite a tough one when you've got behavior that you observe that seems to be quite unethical. In some ways, you have to judge it as universal,
Mm.
but the danger is that it's interpreted as you imposing your culture on the other culture.
Yeah.
So,
I think
yeah,
it's almost a topic for a separate webinar. There's a lot to reflect on, I think, in that topic. But hopefully we've kind of answered for you, Brendan. That's an interesting comment. Thank you, Rosita, about history. Yeah, and I take your point there. Um, I think we've probably got time for one more question, and there's something coming from Pfizer, which is quite interesting, around as a North American, whether she feels that she comes across as quite direct here in the UK, um, and is that the same as is the direct indirect dichotomy the same as the rude polite? So what should she do to maintain her directness, but make sure she's not being perceived as being rude?
it's a really interesting one,
Mm,
Pfizer, and I think it's very common actually as I
mm,
said, I think Americans can come over and the idea of being open and being expressive and being out there, and also divulging a lot of things about yourself and your personal background. Oh, okay, Canadian, sorry, North American, excuse me. And it's really an interesting effect. Now, the difference between directness and rudeness or politeness is an interesting one. It's not exactly the same, is it? The fact is that politeness is kind of this judgment that we make, and it is very culturally bound. The Brits put a lot of emphasis on verbal politeness and expressing things, but we don't. Every time we use polite language here doesn't mean that we're being polite. Someone steps on your foot in a crowded underground train, and I do it myself. Say, "Oh, excuse me," and I'll use a polite phrase to them, but I'm actually saying, "Get off my bloody foot." So that means that in this culture, it's what people tend to do. There may be individuals who are more direct, but generally we look at this directness as a bad thing and not quite, cricket. It's not the done thing. We should use a subtle way of saying things. So it's a tough one.
I think polite is a very abstract
Yeah, yeah,
term, isn't
it's a
it, with
judgment.
many
It's
different
very
meanings. Mm.
subjective in many ways, and I think the cultural norms are interesting. Really, really interesting how they can differ from culture to culture, even between English-speaking cultures, North American, Canadian, and Brit. There's not that much difference between Canadian language use as well and Brits, but there's still the cultural aspect of that. So my advice to you, Faisal, would be
Absolutely.
to tone it down a bit, to put a bit more of the could you possibly at the start of the sentence. Um, but of course, you have to be yourself, and people won't necessarily take offence if you're straight. And it is down to your body language as well, and your smile and whatever. But know that with strangers, it's always good to kind of follow the protocol and try to be a little bit more, uh, polite with your phrases than you might normally. It's true that we don't mean it, but it does mean something. It has a cultural meaning here that you're supposed to do it. It's just something that we do.
Yep, great. Thank you. Simone, great question. We let me see if I can find something that we can share with you in terms of reading. We also run courses here on working with the British specifically, so I can send you some information on that as well. We are almost out of time, so thanks again, Rob. That was a great session. Lots of really interesting insights. Obviously, we've only really skimmed the surface in the time we have together. So, if you're interested in doing something a little bit more in depth with us, then, please let us know. We run half day and 1 day workshops as well as these taster webinars on a whole range of intercultural topics. And just to draw your attention to our next webinar, only a couple of weeks away now on the 6th of September. So a broad topic around developing your cultural competence. So looking at the skills you need to work effectively across cultures. So tune in for that one. We'll be sending out the invite next week. So yeah, look out for that in your inboxes. Otherwise, I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you all so much for joining us again, and thanks one more time to Rob. It's been a great pleasure to have you on the webinar this month. So thank you all. Bye bye.